Okay, so starting off today's show, I thought of an interesting segment I wanted to do, and a segment that not only I wanted to share my opinion on, but once I'm done, I'm really curious to see what you guys think the answer to this question is. And basically, I'll start off by asking this question to you. If you were to pick one team in each conference that made the playoffs last year that you think is going to miss the playoffs this year, and then if you were going to pick one team who missed the playoffs last year that you think is going to make it this year, who would it be and why? So in total, to recap, it is 4 teams. It's an AFC team that you think made it last year you think is going to miss it this year, an AFC team that you think is going to make it this year that missed last year, and then same thing in the NFC. So boys, I'm going to share my picks. Hit the music. Without further ado, here we go. We'll start off in the AFC, and that's with the team that missed the playoffs last year that I think is going to make it this year, and that is the Denver Broncos. When you look at this Broncos team, I've been someone that has been on this bandwagon since really the beginning of the offseason. Last year, under the first-year head coach, Vic Fangio, the season didn't really start off that great. They really looked like they didn't have anything going. But then as the season went on, as they got a little healthier, and as Drew Lock took over as the starting quarterback, this team did go 4-1 down the stretch over their last 5 games. And I'm not saying that they're going to win the division. Obviously, you have the defending Super Bowl champion Chiefs in that division. But at the same time, I really like what John Elway did in terms of getting as much talent around Drew Lock as possible and really putting Drew Lock in the best position to succeed. When you look at the skill position players on this Denver Bronco team, they have already Philip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. They decide to bring in Melvin Gordon from the Chargers. That's a division rival. They also decide to bring in Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler from the NFL draft and pair them along with Cortland Sutton, a guy that I think could break out this year as one of the better wide receivers in football. You also have Noah Fant at tight end. Then you look at the defense. Bradley Chubb, the former top 5 pick, he actually got hurt last year. Early in the season, he missed the rest of the season, and it looks like he's going to be back and ready to go for week 1 this season. And when you also throw Jarrell Casey into the mix, who, if you don't remember him, he is actually the defensive lineman that they got in a big-time trade from the Tennessee Titans in the offseason. So Jarrell Casey could definitely be a guy that makes a significant impact on this Broncos team. Also, you look at the rest of their defense, I like their linebackers. Along with Bradley Chubb, they have Von Miller still there. They have Josie Jewell. My only small concern initially for this Denver Bronco team is the state of their offensive line. Jawan James, who was their big free agent signing from a year ago, he played well last year, but he actually opted out due to COVID. And then on the left side, Garrett Bowles hasn't really played well his first couple years in Denver. So I think the offensive line could be a small concern. They decided to bring in Wood Cushenberry, the center from LSU. You got to assume that he's going to get a crack at it. Graham Glasgow's a guy that could play. Dalton Risner. So if the Broncos' offensive line could step up, I think they're in a really good spot. And I think they would be my team to make the playoffs this year in the AFC that missed last year. Moving on in the AFC to the team that made it last year that I think is going to miss this year. And let's go to the AFC South. And I'm going to have to say the Tennessee Titans. And my thing with the Tennessee Titans is this. There are parts of this team that I still really like. I think Mike Vrabel is a pretty decent coach. Like, he did a really good job with this team last year. I think Derrick Henry is a phenomenal player. But at the same time, when you look at this team, everything just screams regression to me. And there are a couple reasons why. Number one, from week 10 on last year until the rest of the season, like, I'm not kidding here. Derrick Henry, you can make a case, was literally had the best 8-game stretch in the history of the NFL by a running back. When you think about that, how crazy is it? And as good of a player as he is, I just don't see a scenario where he at least doesn't take a small step back. And then you go to the quarterback spot. Ryan Tannehill, I understand he played well down the for the Titans down the stretch last year, but throughout his career, he's averaged 7 yards per pass attempt. Last year, you know what he averaged? 9. That screams regression this year to me, and he's never been that good of a quarterback. He's never really been that consistent of a quarterback when he was in Miami. I have a hard time seeing him put it together 2 years in a row. When you look at this Titan defense, I think they're decent. I think they're one of the more underrated units in the league, but at the same time, there isn't really that many names on this defense that stands out to you as like, all right, that guy's just flat out a playmaker. I love Evans, the linebacker from Alabama, but they lost Jarrell Casey, and they're going to need some of the younger guys like Jeffrey Simmons and, like Daquan Jones, who's not really young, but he's a guy that can make plays. Adoree Jackson as well, Amani Hooker in the secondary. And I think when you look at this Titan team, as much as I love A.J. Brown, Ryan Tannehill, and Derrick Henry at the top, they really just scream regression to me. And Vic Beasley right now, he was their big free agent signing in the offseason really to replace Jarrell Casey, but he's inactive right now. He still hasn't reported for camp. So I think when you look at the state of this Tennessee Titan team, I don't love the direction they're going in, and I think if I were to pick one team in the AFC to miss the playoffs this year that made it last year, it would be the Tennessee Titans. Okay, moving on to the NFC. The question was, if you were to pick one team in the NFC that missed the playoffs last year that you think is going to make it this year, who would it be and why? And for me, my answer would be Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I mean, look, I understand that last year Tom Brady looked done, and the Patriots offense really couldn't get going at all. But the main reason why I like this Tampa Bay Buccaneer team so much this year is not only because of Tom Brady and not only because of Tom Brady's ability. I was the same person that sat behind this microphone last year and flat out told you Tom Brady looks finished, the Buccaneers offense can't play, the Patriots offense can't play, they can't score. And the main reason why I said that was because the combination of many things. It was Tom Brady just not really looking like he could play anymore. Like, he wasn't really taking the risks and the deep throws down the field. And the problem with that was that the Patriots didn't have an efficient running game at all. They didn't have any pass catchers that really scared you. Their offensive line really struggled. And I think when you look at this Tampa Bay Buccaneer team, the opposite of that applies. I think they're going to be able to run the ball a little bit with Ronald Jones and then either Dario Gumbawale or the rookie Keyshawn Vaughn or LaShawn McCoy. I think one of those guys eventually will get an opportunity and run with it. You look at their receivers, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin is one of the best duos in the league. They bring in Tyler Johnson, the rookie from Minnesota. I think he could make an impact right away. Then you look at tight ends, Gronk, Cameron Brate, O.J. Howard. All of those guys are still there and are ready to make an impact. And more importantly, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense is better than you would expect. And let me explain. Even though they didn't really stand out to anyone in any specific games last year, when you look at the numbers a little deeper, they were better than you would expect. And when you look at the names, they have some guys here. Vita Vea and Ndamukong Suh on the defensive line are two guys that could get to the quarterback somewhat easily. They bring in Nunez Roches. They bring in William Golson. They have some guys on the defensive line. Then you look at their linebackers, and these are really the guys that could get to the quarterback. Shaq Barrett was he was the best pass rusher in football last year. You have Levante David. You have JPP. You have Devin White, the young linebacker, from LSU. I think he can make an impact. You look at their defense. They have some young guys in the secondary. Carlton Davis. Sean Murphy-Bunting, Antoine Winfield, the rookie who they drafted from Minnesota, Jamal Dean. There are guys in the secondary that really impressed Bruce Arians at the back end of the season. And the most important point is this. Even though Jameis Winston led the National Football League in touchdowns last season, I think in the big picture, he was more of a negative for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as a whole, because he would, even though he would throw all those touchdowns, he would turn the ball over so much and throw so many interceptions that he would just put this Buccaneer defense in an impossible position to succeed. Even though Tom Brady isn't going to lead the NFL in touchdown passes this season, I still think he'll be better than Jameis Winston and turn the ball over much less than Jameis Winston in order for this Tampa Bay Buccaneer team to be good. I really like the way these guys play. With Brady, I like the way their team is set up. And if I were to pick one team in the NFC that missed the playoffs last year to make it this year, my pick would be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Okay, moving on to the last and final question in this segment, and that is now, if you were to pick one NFC team that made the playoffs last year that you think is going to miss this year, who would it be and why? And my answer may surprise some people, but I'm going to have to say the Minnesota Vikings. And I'm not saying I don't like this Viking team anything, specifically. I think last year, Mike Zimmer deserves credit for the job he did with that team. But when you look at the trajectory of the Minnesota Vikings over the last couple of years, they haven't really been good in back-to-back years ever. And I want to see that from this specific Minnesota Viking team. But from a pure football perspective, there are a couple keys here. Number one, even though Kirk Cousins did go into New Orleans and beat the Saints in a playoff game last year, I want to see it from him a little bit more. I know he's capable of performing in the big moments now, and that is great to know, but I still don't trust him as a quarterback that I think could win a big game. None of the skill position players in particular are guys that when I look at the season that I think they're going to have, none of them are guys that I'm just going to say are going to dominate the league and are going to lead the Vikings to a playoff spot by themselves. I love Dalvin Cook. I understand that he is playing for a contract this year. I think he's one of the better running backs in the league, but I just don't necessarily trust his production behind this offensive line. I like Adam Thielen, but keep in mind this team lost Stephon Diggs, so it's going to be interesting to see how he adjusts to being that number one cleared target for Kirk Cousins now. And I also understand this team drafted Justin Jefferson, but at the same time, he struggled a little bit so far in camp. And even though eventually I think he is going to be a big-time player for this Minnesota Viking team, I don't necessarily know if I see that happening in his rookie season. They have some other pass catchers in Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith. I just don't think their offensive line is really good enough. Even though they did improve a little bit last year, I need to see a little bit more. The other thing most people are going to say about this Viking team and why I'm crazy for picking them is when you look at their defense, they just added Yannick Ngakoue from the Jacksonville Jaguars. And we're going to get specifically into Jacksonville in a little bit and just the absolute demise of their team. But Ngakoue is a real player. They also have Anthony Barr, Eric Kendricks, and drafted some young guys in the secondary. It's just when I look at this Viking team, there are a couple factors in terms of why specifically I don't think they will be making the playoffs this year. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, this team just hasn't really been able to make the playoffs in back-to-back years ever. And I'm not really going to pick it to happen until I see it. That's number one. Number two, even though Kirk Cousins did go into New Orleans last year, led the Minnesota Vikings to a playoff win after that big-time throw to Adam Thielen, that was a sick play. And don't get me wrong, Kirk deserves credit for that. I just have a hard time believing that it's going to happen again. And as good as this Viking team is, I don't ever see Kirk Cousins being good enough to win them a Super Bowl. And when you look at their offensive line as well, I think those two factors are going to be the big two things that eventually lead this Minnesota Viking team to missing the playoffs. The other main factor for me is just that their division is really hard. I think Detroit is going to be better than people expect. I think on paper, and I know this is hard for me to say this about the Detroit Lions, their history over the last 50 years really hasn't been good at all. But I'm telling you, on paper and really just overall, the Detroit Lions offense this year should be pretty good. When you look at Matthew Stafford at quarterback, DeAndre Swift, Kenny Golladay, Marvin Jones, a top 10 pick at tight end in TJ Hawkinson. They have some guys there that better start producing. And then you look at Chicago, look, theoretically, their defense should still be one of the top units in the league. No matter who their quarterback is, Nick Foles or Mitchell Trubisky, I don't really know if they're going to be good enough to win them games from that position. I just don't really love either quarterback. But I think the Bears, with David Montgomery running the ball, they still have Allen Robinson at receiver. I still think they'll be good enough and competitive enough in certain games to at least play well. And I'm higher on the Packers. I mean, I think this division is full of 4 decent teams. I don't necessarily know if they have a legit Super Bowl contender, but I think this division will probably be one of the more competitive divisions in the NFL, and that is another reason why, if you were to ask me, if you were to pick one team in the NFC that made the playoffs last year that you think is going to miss this year, my answer for you would be the Minnesota Vikings.